Howdy, howdy, and welcome back to Gale FFTCG. I'm Serah, your host, and today we need to talk about FFTCG. Right now, the game is probably in maybe the worst place it's been since the Doga Sophie meta. And I really hate to say that because there aren't just two decks that are running around that are just the best deck and aggro is the only way to play, but it might as well be. And we're going to start talking about that with some stats. So, out of the 10 largest worldwide events, EU, Japan, and USA regions in total, these are kind of the biggest ones. Obviously, I'm not going to include any event that's under 20 players, just because it's a better sounding board if if you're not taking every single locals into account, etc., because the locals will probably be playing fun decks and decks of their own, which is absolutely fine, and I think that is the way the game should be played, but unfortunately, the meta exists, and we need to talk about the meta. So, Mastery in major events with a top cut, 46% of lists are running Mastery. It's worth noting that half of those lists, a little over half those lists, are soiree lists, which soirees was most certainly not intended to be run with Mastery. So that says a lot about Mastery, just because it's that strong that you will literally go out of your way to put Mastery in your deck and put a number of summons in your deck that work for Mastery. Decks with wind cards are almost 50% of all lists. It doesn't matter if it's just like a Pekiota and a soiree list or whatever. Wind cards are strong enough that they are seeing play in almost half of the major meta lists. And that is really, really kind of scary for any element. There was a point where fire was that, and I would have argued that fire was probably in maybe having it a little too good. And this tends to be the trend that one element is better than another, and there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but there are some certain things about wind that make it feel far worse than when fire was the meta. And we have 23% of soiree lists. That's not as high as you might think across the entire board. But some of these are from Japan, some of these are from the USA. Interestingly enough, in Europe, there are hardly any soiree lists actually seeing top cut. I don't know if that is more of something about the players or more something about where the meta is at in the EU. That doesn't necessarily mean that one is particularly worse than another or wrong in that regard. But it's worth knowing that there are some regions in the world where soirees don't feel as powerful. So, with all of those stats, you can draw your own conclusions from them. I'll just kind of leave them there for you to see. You can pause it now. I am going to move on to a couple of problem cards that I think need to get banned or restricted. First of all, we have Mastery. I'm going to preface this by saying I love this card. I love the design space it gives us. I love the implications of this card, and I love that a whole new deck style basically came out because this card exists. And I love that. I played Doga. I had a lot of fun with Doga. I've played Mono Water. I've obviously shared with you my Ice and Water summons list that runs Mastery and features it. I love this card. But unfortunately, I also know how big of a problem it can be because I've played with this card quite frequently. There is a reason I think I've only ever put up one list with Mastery in it, and that was the Ice Water list. And that was because I had a lot of fun with that, not because Mastery was in it. I just enjoyed the list as a whole. And I thought it was worth sharing. But you'll notice I've tried to lean away from sharing Mastery lists because they are that strong, and because you basically need to play Mastery to even consider your list being powerful, or you need to play wind cards or something super aggressive. So, first of all, the issues lie in the fact she's a princess, so she can be searched by quite a few different things. Serah being the most used method. It draws cards for free, it chooses forward, or it bounces forwards for free, so it's basically removal for free, and it reduces the cost of summons passively and actively. It can do all this for free. The fact it's a light card doesn't really affect it because it is still only 2 CP, it's 6k, so it's above Brynhildr range, so you can't even just go, I'm going to cast one Brynhildr to shoot Mastery and kill it. You have to literally do anything extra, and then Mastery can just protect herself. You know it's bad that when Mastery hits the field, you have to start playing the game of how many times can I force Mastery to activate her ability. And there's nothing wrong with those sort of things either. Those create interesting sacks, but Mastery just does that so easily, and it really forces your opponent to basically play a different type of game, and that's only fun for the first, handful of times you play it, and then there's a point where your opponent just goes, oh man, there's Mastery on the field, I'm kind of just bored, I don't want to play this game anymore. And that is kind of the issue with the meta right now, is the meta is so swingy and just feels so... It doesn't feel rich, it just feels thin. Every game that you play where you see like the best lists go toe-to-toe, it usually ends up swinging one way or the other. If you're playing against Mono Wind, you are probably going to lose because their board is going to get really massive really quickly, and they're just going to play a Bismarck and they're just going to ping all your things to death, and it doesn't matter, and the game just ends. You'll have those Storm games where your opponent has 4 backups by the end of turn 2, and you're sitting there wondering, what am I going to do with my 1 backup? I can't hope to out-resource my opponent. And the problem is that the list of cards that you should and can run is getting smaller and smaller because these lists exist. If you build outside of those lists, you're not able to do stuff. And Mastery, creating a beautiful style of list that has a cool, unique thing, I sacrifice my amount of forwards and my amount of backups for summons, is really awesome. But the problem is that strategy is really strong. And Mastery means that you basically can drop 1 forward and suddenly your opponent is like playing against an army. And that is really difficult for anyone to beat. Even the best players in the world know Mastery is a hard card to play against. But moving on, we need to talk about the answer to Mastery and Win decks, and that is Avalanche. Avalanche, notably, has only ever topped 1 event. However, it is the London Re-Raise event, which had 103 participants. It's the largest event of 2022 worldwide. And that in and of itself is a statement to how strong this deck is, that it came first in a 103-person event. That is massive. Barrett, again, has similar problems to Mastery. It is a very searchable category, FF7. It has 9k power, which is very inconvenient to shoot at. Barrett, if it takes damage less than its power, survives. You have to waste additional resources to kill Barrett. It gives everything haste, and because it's an Avalanche operative, you can play this turn 1, and suddenly all of your other Avalanche operatives suddenly become super cheap. Again, it generates advantage. It makes things cheaper. It's a bit like a slightly less powerful Stan Leonis. For those of you who don't know what that card did before it got banned, it reduced the power of forwards by 1. Or the cost of forwards by 1. So you could just play them and they just cost less. And on top of that, you could remove 4 summons and like shoot something, buff your board, or destroy a monster. And those things were all very powerful things. Barrett has a activated ability where you can discard a card and you can get back an Avalanche operative that isn't, as long as it's not Barrett. You can only do it once per turn, but even still, that is so powerful. You can get back ways of saving your board, or if your board's about to die to a board wipe, which is kind of the best way to beat Avalanche, you just go, okay, cool. So I'm going to discard this and get back something else before you blow up my board so I can just keep playing the game. It's so hard when you board wipe your opponent and they just build the same board again very quickly, which Avalanche operatives can do. This is the problem, that when this 1 forward comes down, immediately the game is you suddenly have to start playing the game on hard mode. And the problem is there are very few decks that can play it on hard mode. Even Mashery will struggle to a turn 1 Barret. Any summon deck will struggle to a turn 1 Barret because you have to spend so many resources getting rid of the Barret that the rest of the Avalanche operatives are still there after you deal with that. And that's the problem, is the game is so swingy and so advantage-based that even the best aggro decks in the game are still have card advantage. The classic thing with aggro in every game that I've ever played is that aggro lists run out of resources. And they either win the game by turn 5 or they lose the game by turn 5. And that is the risk/reward that you get for playing any sort of aggro game in any sort of anything else. And that is awesome. That's why I love aggro as a strategy. You put in so much and you win, or if your opponent plays well, you lose. And it feels fair. Fair aggro will be, I attack you a bunch of times and I don't get anything in return. Unfortunately, this and the Doga deck, when it existed, said that's not true. It said, I can beat you and I also have a full card hand of 5, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that is where people start to feel bad. That's where a game becomes toxic, when the best decks in the game are the ones that kind of almost cheese and just play big bodies and swing as much as they can, but also lose nothing for it. That is a very sad place to be. Now, talking about advantage, we're going to talk about the other type of advantage that should feel good but really doesn't right now. You have Atomos. Atomos is a wind card, as you may have noticed. There's a reason I talked about the wind cards. Atomos and the decks that it goes in are very strong because they're setup decks, which have been a thing until the Doga Sophie meta. They're setup decks that set up 4 backups by turn 2, and at that point, even unless you're playing an aggressive thing that only plays like 1 backup on turn 1, if even that, then you're gonna win. Any of the fair decks get preyed upon by this other deck that out advantages them and basically outspeeds them by just having more ways of continuous advantage. In other games, control decks have famously been, I don't start playing until I look like I'm losing. This is true in Magic the Gathering, and there's a few other games out there that it's like, oh no, I'm on 1 damage. Say like for Digimon or Magic, but suddenly my opponent's burned out of resources and I've been gaining resources the whole game. And that feels good. It's the opposite of aggro. It's where my opponent has burned out everything, now I get to play the game. And in those type of games, it's the meta is healthy when there's a control deck and an aggro deck, and the two have somewhat interesting matchups against each other. Unfortunately, Atomos basically, unless you're playing an aggro deck, basically says, I have taken all the things I learned, that you learn to do in the game, such as play backups to play forwards and gain some advantage from doing that, and basically says, I'm going to play the control game aggressively, and I'm going to just put out as much advantage as I can, and then I just win from there. It's bad when players are like, I have played, I'm in a really good position for my deck, but the wind deck across from me is playing 3 times better than I could play, and I can't get around that. There's no way for me to win. There's no way for me to even come back, even though I am doing so well right now. And that is a problem. When all 3 of the decks that I've talked about are basically able to counter each other, but there's no room for any outliers, any rogue decks at all. And that's why I wanted to actually highlight, going back to our stats, that Soirees is actually not that big in the meta, comparatively. It still has a little bit of a good showing. It still shows up in lists, and it still shows up in top cuts. But those lists are running Mashery, and the win decks are nearly half of those decks. This is the problem. We need to look at why these specific cards are, an issue. We need to look at why these styles of decks are an issue. Because Soiree right now feels kind of fair. At least in my kind of local level, no one's playing Soirees anymore. Which is not to say Soirees are a bad deck per se. It's just that we very quickly were like, well, how do we beat Soirees? Figured out how to beat Soirees, and then we're like, okay, we don't care about Soirees anymore. That's not to say that's what it's like in the rest of the world, obviously. I think it's important to acknowledge the meta in other places in the world and consider why it is the way it is that way. But I think it's more important also that the meta is more varied. As a little bit of an anecdote, I suppose, we had a locals where everyone was playing meta and we all wanted, we wanted to win, but we were like, oh man, like we played meta, and at the end of the day, everyone was like, we're done. We're done playing meta. We don't like meta. And even the most competitive players in the room were like, man, it feels bad to play the meta. And that is an indicator that even when the competitive players who love to discuss this, the players who are the most passionate in the room about it and who just have such a love for the game, were tired of it. Afterwards, we took away some of those cards. We were like, let's not play win decks. Let's not play the meta. Let's just, play for fun. And we had the most fun we've had in a long time. And my local scene is a very high-powered local scene. And to hear players go, we're having more fun playing these than playing the meta. One player won with 1 CP Leo deck. I was on a Tricolor Knights list, which I may put up on the channel. There was so much fun had all around for every player there. And that, to me, is the biggest problem with the game, is that when you have a bunch of players who are passionate about it and want to win, getting bored of winning, that you're probably doing something wrong. And to highlight the point that Machery needs a ban, that win cards need less of a focus on, that Soirees isn't as broken as you think just because the meta is as super high powered as it is. It's important that as soon as those cards were gone, the game got more fun, and we need to get rid of those. Machery needs a ban. The more we talk about Machery needing banned, and even if you don't see it at your local level, look at the stats, look at the amount of lists that run a Machery in them, and look at how easy Machery is to spread across everything that exists in this game, and tell me Machery does not need banned. Look at the decks, the win decks that are like auto setup and you just win by just being able to set up really quickly. Look at Avalanche, or play with these decks if you don't believe me on how strong these ones are. Just because you have not played against it or have not played the deck doesn't mean that it's not powerful. I would implore you to look at the decks that are winning lists, play those decks, or watch the best players play those decks. There are obviously lots of streams that you can watch. Alex Hancock has his stream that he puts up for lists, etc., etc. Look at the YYT's YouTube channel. I don't tend to put meta, but you can still look at my channel. Obviously, I would love that. But look at the decks that are winning. Ask why they're winning, and then try and build those decks for yourself, even if it's not at a locals level. Because honestly, we're like, at least in my locals, we go out of our way to play kind of fun locals decks, and look at those lists and try and figure out why they're strong. Then make your decisions for the bans. I think the more that we talk about this, the more we share this around, the more that the game designers take notice, and the more that game designers will want to either fix these problems or create ways of countering these problems. But yeah, that's kind of all my rant has to say, I suppose. But yeah, stick around for more videos coming very, very soon. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. That means a lot. We're at 70 subscribers, which is awesome. But the more that you like this, the more that obviously the rest of the FFTCG community gets to see all the videos that I'm putting out. And the more that helps the channel. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day and a great rest of your week.